Live from Schorr Manor Studios, this is Tales from a Small Town Journalist with Matt Schorr.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out this episode of Tales from a Small Town Journalist, the podcast dedicated to all the weird and wonderful stories you are only going to hear about from reporters working in small communities. Small communities just like yours. I'm Matt Shore, and I was one of those small town reporters for nearly 10 years before I finally hung up my camera and my notepad. And in those years, I got to know some interesting people. I had some unique and interesting experiences working with the public, and I got to know some other folks who also had some unique and interesting experiences working with the public. Before I go any further, I do want to make sure and mention this is a listener supported podcast supported by wonderful folks just like you. There are some great ways that you could show us some support. Just go visit my website, www.mattschorr.net. That's MATTSCHORR.net. Go visit the bookstore, the t-shirt shop, see if they got anything that might strike your interest. We have books, we have comics, and we have a newly launched magazine. So please go check that out. And we have a whole line of spooky t-shirts delivered straight from Shore Manor. So go check those out. See if you got any designs you like. That'd be a phenomenal way to show us a little bit of financial love. But if you can't do that, another great way to show some support is just, get the word out. Tell people about us. Let people know about this kooky little podcast and the funny stories that we like to tell. Tell a friend, tell a loved one, tell a neighbor, give them out, get them by the shoulder, give them a good shake and say, hey, you've got to subscribe and check out this podcast by Matt Shore. And you've got to give it a good review and a good rating. And please don't arrest me for shaking you and getting in your face like this since we don't know each other. But, use social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you have at your disposal. Just help get the word out about us. That'd be fantastic. We'd love you for it. This episode, I am bringing back the very first guest that I ever had. I meant to do this sooner, but various things just got in the way. Timing, schedules, the pandemic, sickness, a whole lot of other things. But finally, I was able to get Shelley Byrne back. A whole lot has changed since she and I first knew each other. Few things have even changed since I first asked her if she'd come back for the podcast. So time does a lot of things. Shelley's done a whole lot of work in the journalistic field. She's never left journalism, but she's worked for several different publications. So she's had quite a prolific career. She even made a stop off at the publication that I once worked at, the Mayfield Messenger. So uh, I wasn't there when she did that. So we never have worked together. At least under the same roof, but we've constantly been colleagues covering the same things. There were so many times that she and I would end up in a courtroom together covering one of the latest crime dramas going on in my town, or some kind of event that she also happened to be covering. But we crossed paths quite a bit. Usually it was crime stuff, constantly in the courtroom that she and I saw each other. That's just how it worked out. But she had some great stories the first time. She's got some good stories to tell now. She's moved on from actual newspaper reporting to something a little bit less intense, we'll say, with magazines. And just kind of like me, I've moved on to things that are a bit less intense. Moved out of the front lines to where it's a little bit safer, so to speak. That's a young person's job, and I am starting to grudgingly accept the fact that I am no longer one of those young people. But here we are. Anyway, it was a great chat. Really cool getting to catch up with Shelley again. So we'll shift gears right now and let's go hear from Shelley Byrne. This episode of Tales from a Small Town Journalist is brought to you by Grave Diggers Magazine, unearthing the horror stories of yesteryear and uniting them with the horror of today. Enjoy terrifying comics from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, alongside columns and interviews from horror creators of the modern era. Grave Diggers, published by Shore Manor Studio and available at mattshore.net. Okay, I am joined by an old friend, and the first guest I ever had. So this is cool to have you back. This is Shelley Byrne, a prolific news reporter. I'm not even going to begin to try to list all the places you've worked. You've had quite the career that really dwarfs mine. Thanks for coming back.
I'm glad to be here.
Much appreciated. Much appreciated. I'll leave it to you. Do you want to list your extensive experience with journalism all over the place?
Sure. I came to the Paducah Sun originally as an intern, was supposed to stay there for 12 weeks, so I left 12 years later as senior reporter. And then got out of journalism for about 5 years and got bit by the journalism bug again and worked for the Mayfield Messenger for a little over 2 years.
I've heard of them.
Indeed, they're quite well known. And then got an opportunity to work for the Waterways Journal, and that's a trade publication for the barge and towing industry, based out of St. Louis. It's been around since the 1880s,
Nice. Very good.
and I get to work from home for that publication, so that works really well for my schedule. And yet I get to still leave the house and go see people, which is so important. We found out during this pandemic, and travel a little more widely. I like that too.
Yeah, that's any it's key for journalism, and I think we discovered it's also key for human beings just in general. We are social creatures.
Indeed, indeed, very much so.
So tell me a little bit about working for this Waterways journalism journal. You told me some of this, but what's that been like?
It's been enjoyable. It's been very different. Community journalism, you're always focused on what's going on in that immediate area at one time. I'm the Ohio River Valley correspondent, so my immediate area is anything as far away as Pittsburgh all the way to Cairo.
Okay.
So it's you can't physically be in all of those places. So you really do have to develop those sources and those networks. That's very important. Um, the navigation industry is a very small industry in comparison to some others. So a lot of folks know each other, so that networking is made easier by that. But these are also folks who have mostly kept to their own side of the flood wall and haven't told their stories to a lot of folks who don't have that experience working from a deckhand on up. So it's not working with people who deal with journalists every single day, and you have to get to know someone well before they trust you to tell their story.
The challenge every journalist faces, whatever medium, publication, you name it, that they work for.
Indeed. And there are a lot more events that I cover here. It's not wrecks and fires and those sorts of things typically, and I'm glad for that. It's often meetings, conferences, groundbreakings, christenings. So there is a lot more good news that I get to tell in this role. And I find that that fits me better at this stage of my career too.
That's interesting because when we knew each other, you were very much into digging digging for the truth and bringing it out. And so it sounds like you've mellowed a little bit.
Probably have mellowed just a little bit. Um, you can only go to so many really bad news scenes and it not affect you over time.
Hmm. True.
And we were driving around home one day, and my husband said, we were having a really nice drive. And then you pointed out, oh, they found the body over there.
Yeah.
He said I was like some sort of grim tour guide. And I had to think to myself, is that what I wanted to do for longer? And there comes a time where you're like, no, I've seen enough of that. Thank you very much. There are still things with this job that get the adrenaline running, but less of that, and I'm okay with that at this point.
It makes me think of police. I remember one time going out to cover some kind of wreck, and the sheriff's department was out there, and the sheriff himself was actually on the scene, and it was a pretty gruesome one. I won't go into details, but there was some gore on the road when I got there, and I'm standing next to some of that gore, next to the sheriff, and he points down like right into the heart of all of this, and there's like a piece of one of the cars there, and it was the Dodge logo that just happened to be there, and he points to it and then looks at me and says, "That's what they should have done."
Oh my.
And it's that, wow, you've been doing this a long time that you're able to make that kind of a joke in the midst of this.
Yeah, the people I knew who had the jokes that came out of nowhere are most likely to get you were invariably coroners.
Yeah. I still remember a coroner, the coroner of Graves County. He knew me so well because he'd been doing it forever when I started, and he was still there when I left. But there was some it was some murder victim. They found the body, and I didn't see any of that. Thankfully, I got there after that. But he had it in his truck, and he just says, "Oh, hey, come here!" And he walks me around to the back, opens it up, and points to the body basket. Do you want to see it? I'm like, I'm good,
Oh,
actually. No,
no.
I'm good. Don't need any more. Yeah, the decent. And it's like I think I am also glad that I got out before I reached that level of desensitization. Is that a word?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I think that's a very fair point. That there just comes a point when you're done with that part of it, and I reached that point. I
Yeah.
still love my community, and it's difficult not to know what's going on whenever you hear sirens go by.
Yeah. I get that itch too every time.
I think that will always be with me in some regard. But there also comes a time when you go, not my circus, not my monkeys, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I hear you. Definitely. But speaking, let me hear a little bit about your circus. You say there are occasionally times where the adrenaline gets going. What are the exciting parts of your current job?
It depends. Sometimes there are features that I still love to go after. Um, those can be exciting in their own ways. Occasionally, you do have things happen that are unexpected. Whenever you're writing about boats, there's always the possibility one is going to sink. And just like cars run into each other, sometimes boats do too. So you have to be aware of those things and the possibility of those happen. There are still opportunities to call the Coast Guard and find out what happened in a situation. Sometimes you have a little more time to do that, though. I work for the Waterways Journal as a weekly publication. So there's an ability to sit back and go, that's what I'm going to work on tomorrow. And I think that that helps sometimes. It gives you more an opportunity to hear from those who are involved. Many times when we were writing about those wrecks, those things that happened, you talked to police, but you didn't talk to a company that was involved in something. Now, sometimes there's the opportunity to go back and go, what happened? Or can you tell me a little bit about the situation leading up to this? Many times they can't speak because something's under investigation by the Coast Guard, but there's a much closer relationship between the reporter covering what's happening and the companies that are involved when it's a trade publication.
Okay. You told me before we got on here one time you had to chase down a barge. I've got to hear a little bit more about that one if I can.
Well, not a barge, a bridge.
A bridge. Okay, even better.
Yeah. I mean, it's not every day that you get to chase down a highway bridge. Usually those stay pretty stationary. In this case, it was the main span of the new Cumberland River Bridge that will be for Highway 60. And it was being floated into place. And it was built at the Paducah, Kentucky Riverport. And I got to be at the Riverport that morning and talk to the project manager and then wait for these four jumbo barges with lift towers carrying this giant bridge, steel superstructure. It was enormous, I think 700 feet, something like that, to float downriver and then watch it, escorted by the Coast Guard, make the turn all the way into the Ohio River. And it floated up the Ohio River. And as it was floating up, I would hopscotch ahead of the bridge to where people had gathered at a site and talk to members of the public who were waiting for it to float by. Or in some cases, I had talked to some member companies and had gotten permission to go out and get on their work barges that stuck out a little farther into the river and take really good pictures right there from their barges and then hopscotch ahead. So it was about a 4 or 5 hour process where I stopped 5 or 6 times along the way, hopscotching ahead of this bridge and then watching it float by until it finally got to where it was going and got lifted into place.
So, so you still find yourself in just these un situations you wouldn't consider
We don't.
even here
By
then
the end of
just
it,
like
I had to
okay.
climb on the McCracken County Rescue Squad boat, be able to get a good view from the river Um, and of course, dressed as appropriately professionally for the job. And here I am kicking off my dress shoes, hiking up my dress pants, and wading into the river to climb on a rescue boat to get a good picture of this bridge.
So
And
even without the grim, go
part of
ahead.
me was going, you know, I wouldn't have hesitated on this 20 years ago, and now I'm 44 and climbing and wading into the river and climbing on board a boat, that was a little harder than it used to be.
So, even without the grim aspects, just the weird, unbelievable stuff is still there.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so that's good. Still never a dull moment, I guess.
No, there's not. Another example, and this was a feature story, but still something that was unusual. I had heard that there had been a barge that was stranded on dry land. And you have to get an idea that these barges are enormous. They dwarf a house. Okay. And what had happened was that a few years ago, a levee had broken in southern Illinois, and two huge barges floated into a field by a house, and then the water went down. And they're still sitting there in this farmer's field by his house. And you come around a bend of the highway, and there they are, like giant skyscrapers sticking up in the air in rural farmland in Illinois. And was able to talk with the farmer's wife, who had said what had happened. And they decided, since these barges were taking up so much of their usable farmland, that they were going to charge the barge company rent, daily rent, because it was trespassing on their field. And the barge company came out and they looked at different ways of refloating it. At first, they thought, well, the water will come back up again. That didn't happen. They looked at using some sort of airbag to roll it back across the highway to where the river is supposed to be and get it out that way. They looked at the cost of disassembling it. Finally, the rent had accumulated so much that they just signed over the barges to the farmer. I said, okay, what do you do now? Because you've got the same problem getting it out. And they said, well, it's not really that much of a hazard. We're just going to wait until the water comes back up, and then it'll float them. And we've got a tractor and we can pull them out into the river again. We'll see if we can sell them back to the barge company.
These farmers might just be geniuses.
And he said, if that doesn't happen, no biggie. He's got welding equipment too. He'll just take off a piece at a time and take it to the scrapyard,
That's gonna, gosh, how long is that gonna take?
probably for the rest of that farmer's life. My goodness.
Good Lord. I think I had heard about that. Not all the details you provided, but I think I had heard about barge that was carried by some floodwaters or whatever out into a field in southern Illinois, and they were was just still there. We could, cause yeah, we don't have the anything to do, we don't have trailers that can just pick up a barge and move it, do we?
No, no, these are enormous. I forget what the figures are, but I've seen them a few times now that talked about one barge can hold the equivalent of something like, gee, it might have been 18 rail cars and a locomotive and however many hundreds of trucks that it is. That barges and the towing industry really keep all this congestion off of our highway and move freight in both a safer and more economical way. We don't think about them though because we don't see them every day as we're driving down the highway. They're on America's rivers, and that's one of the things that makes our economy work in the United States that we never think about.
I remember conversations about that. This is way back. I was still at the Mayfield Messenger when I was still working there. Conversations they had about Kentucky making more use of its waterways because I think they felt like it had like the most, given that the Ohio River borders the entire northern border of Kentucky, that we could utilize the waterways more than we do to cut back on the need for so much in the trucking industry.
There is actually a lot of ability to increase freight on the river system in the United States. In fact, the U.S. Maritime Administration has started a grant program that is specifically for trying to move certain freight from the roads to the rivers. And there was also a major river port study in Kentucky last year talking about how we could better utilize Kentucky's public ports. and what freight is available that might be available for switching modes, and how the ports can be used better for economic development in the state. I think there's a really great future. Um, Normally, years ago, when I was driving to the riverfront, what you primarily saw on barges was coal, and the coal
Mhm.
industry has declined quite a bit, even in Kentucky. So we have to have something that replaces that. What we're finding is that there are now more chemicals. The ability to transport diesel on the waterways makes a lot of sense, and it provides some safety and security also. When the ransomware attack shut down the pipeline to the entire southeast United States, communities that could still get gasoline by barge did better than those that couldn't. There's actually a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville that studied the differences between Nashville and Knoxville during that time. And the price of gas in Nashville was much cheaper, and gas was much more available there. And that was because of the ability to get it by barge. And the industry worked very well to make that happen. There actually had been a lock closure scheduled during that time, and they were able to stop at a certain point in that process and let barges of diesel go through in order to keep that shortage from being worse.
Hmm. Okay. That is interesting. As I say, we've there was all this talk about it, and I have not done any research on this, but just given when I'm out on the road, all of the trucks that I see, it doesn't look like we have done a whole lot to transition over to using the waterways more.
Well, we certainly are still dealing with very congested highways,
Mm,
but the more and more we're able to use the water resources, the more sense it makes. One big concern is that our infrastructure on the river system is very, very old. You
mm.
have a lot of locks and dams built in the 1930s, 1940s, some even older than that. And those have got to be upgraded in order for the system to work efficiently. Anytime that you have a very, very small lock and you're having to break one of these big toes in half and do what's called a double locking, and in some cases you have to do a triple locking, that takes time, and time is money in the industry. So to keep the system flowing efficiently, those have got to continue to be upgraded. Um, and I had another point there, but it's escaping me right now. I'm sure it'll come back to me at some point.
That's how it works. Well, any other exciting stories that really got your adrenaline going, either working for this publication or previous ones?
There have been a lot of them. Um, I do remember back when my husband and we've been married 18 years now. Um, I don't know if we were married yet. I think we were just dating. Um, but we had an agreement that if I had to go into a situation that was dangerous, that I would call. And I would let him know I'm going into a situation. I'll call you when I'm out. Because some situations were not as safe. Um, Anytime you have to go behind police lines, there's a possibility of problems. So I remember my editor saying, there's a giant smoke cloud over downtown Paducah, and we can hear people converging on that point, and we don't know what it is. And calling my husband and going, there's a big smoke cloud, and I'm going toward it, and I don't exactly know what it is yet, but I'll call you when I'm done. It turned out to be a truck fire. The truck had pretty much exploded, and I understand you could actually see that cloud from a county away. It was
Wow.
huge. And it was right in front of a nursing home, which they were having to evacuate at the time because they didn't know if there were going to be more explosions. So things like that certainly get your blood pumping. Another time, there had been a chemical release from a chemical plant in Calvert City, Kentucky, and the wind was blowing over into Livingston County, and there were birds falling out of the sky. And I was going toward that. So there were situations like that certainly got the blood pumping. But again, not necessarily something that I'm not only a wife, but a mother now, and I don't want to put myself in those situations anymore. So it's nice to be able to have a job where I can go, somebody else can deal with that, and then we'll check back in on it tomorrow.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah,
it's
there's
very important to cover those stories, and I'm
yes.
still
Mhm.
very much supportive of those going out and doing that. I'm just glad that I have the availability to be able to go, yes, that's important, and yes, I'm going to stay on top of that, and no, I don't have to leave right now and go do that.
Yeah, yeah. We did our time. It's somebody else's turn to be on the front lines for that. My only fear, I guess, is you don't have as many of us sticking around in administrative roles. So many of us are leaving, and I've noticed the newspapers that it's from top to bottom. They're younger, which it feels weird to be talking about that now because I always thought I was the young guy, but not anymore. Because in the newsroom, they're so young. Everybody's fresh out of college, and you don't have. I had this cantankerous old editor who was behind me, ready to like jump at anything that I got wrong, and just grouchy, grumpy, but he believed in the news and getting it right. Whether he believed in getting it right more than he believed in getting it first. That was above all the priority there. And I guess I worry. I don't know that they have that influence the same way that I did. And there are different types of influence, but just somebody there that's just been there who's just really an old, grizzled veteran.
Yeah, we're missing a lot of that newsroom wisdom
Mhm.
from years of doing it, and from years of doing it in some cases the old way, and ways where it meant getting up and going there, where you didn't have to rely on phone calls and emails and video conferencing technology the way that
Yeah.
we're doing now. Um, even even when I started, we were getting a lot of press releases by fax machine. I don't know anybody who has a fax machine anymore, so that's a big difference. No, the people that I had as editors who taught me had been reporters themselves and had been reporters for a long time, and I think that's something we really are missing.
Yeah, I did a short term as a nighttime editor, and I remember I was looked at by some of the folks coming in like, okay, you're the old guard, and I was just like, I just moved here. I'm the old guard now. What? I can't be the old guard. I'm not old enough to be the old guard. But then I look at myself on this Zoom call, like, well, I might be the old guard with this graying goatee that I've got.
I had seen something online not long ago that talked about what I'm the adult now. I can't be the adult and desperately look around for an older adult and adultier adult.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not mature enough to be for there to be so many people that are supposedly less mature than me. What's wrong with the world? It's no wonder every generation looks at the next one with disdain. We're not ready to accept ourselves in that role yet.
Well, and the younger people, my son, he's in middle school now, so things are starting to change. But up until a couple of years ago, he looked at me and expected me to have the right answer for everything. And I found myself wondering, did my parents make up as much stuff as I have to answer his questions?
I've thought that
But
too.
I'm grateful also that I have the ability of going, I don't know about that. Let's Google it because my parents didn't have that option. This is not something where we had to go to the Encyclopedia Britannica anymore and find out, something from years ago that may not even be correct any longer. That I've got devices in the house now. I can ask Alexa on things.
Yes, and luckily, us being former journalists, we're a little bit discerning. We know which sources we can believe and which ones we can't.
Well, and that's a good point too. That as these technology options have increased, there's a there's still a need to find what is a correct option for the question. What's the correct answer? Because you might find four or five different answers to a question out there, and you have to figure out how to vet sources and what's right. I think a lot of the things that we learned in journalism school now, average people are having to learn about how to find a website that is credible and up to date. And Drew's learning these things in school, and I'm glad for it. I think a lot of people still have problems with that. I have certain relatives that if somebody posted it on Facebook, they assume that it's true without double checking anything.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name names, but
Oh, come on. Come on.
but sometimes we have to go over. Okay, did you click on that link? At the first level, And then what website was it?
Hmm. That
And
that's my first question every time. Who reported this?
yes. And then there are publications out there that are ironically reporting things or deliberate sources of made up information that you don't know unless you do a little digging into what is that website all about? What is that publication all about? And most people just don't dig that deeply.
Yeah,
It
and
really
those
bothers me as a journalist that there are places that are out there like that. Certainly, I appreciate people's ability to have all the freedom in the world on reporting, but when you're deliberately reporting false information, that has to be a problem somewhere. I was rather glad to see what had happened with Alex Jones and the Sandy Hook verdict this week,
mhm.
talking about that he now owes all of these families of Sandy Hook victims quite a bit of money because he
It's $1
perpetuated
billion
falsehoods.
dollars all told. $1 billion.
And I thought perhaps that will stop some of this rampant fiction from being perpetuated as news out there. I
Yeah,
hope.
yeah, and some of those sites they frustrate me because I'm a huge fan of The Onion. And people who don't know what The Onion is a satirical newspaper. It is very upfront. This is satirical. And when you look at its headlines, you absolutely know it is satirical because they're so absurd. Um, and just the way they're written is ironic and goofy. And then some of these other ones, they present it completely like it's legitimate. Then at the very bottom, in tiny little print, it acknowledges that it's satirical. And yeah, both as a journalist, that frustrates me because it's misinformation, but also as somebody I really like satire. I love satire. Mel Brooks, I was a huge Mel Brooks fan, and I love the humor of it all. But it's like you're not even doing good satire. On top of this, you're not even presenting it as satire. And also, satire is meant to be funny. It's almost like the joke, it's like a practical joke on readers. And that's where the supposed satire comes in. Like, how many can we fool with this headline into believing it? And then that'll be funny, but then it's nobody's in on the joke except the people that wrote it. And yeah, so a lot of reasons those websites annoy and anger me.
Well, we see it on broadcast television too, that I see a
Yeah.
lot of supposed news channels that have people who are commenting, that are people who are hosting the shows who are not reporters, they're commenting on an issue. And yet the networks don't do a good job of labeling, this is a commentary, this is not news reporting. And
Hmm.
I think people turn on to certain news channels and see someone behind a desk and are used to the days of Walter Cronkite. The person behind the desk is going to tell you what's going on. And in some cases, it's their view on what's going on. And I've had this
Yeah.
conversation with a number of people saying, okay, what is the person who's actually out in the field saying about what just happened versus what is the group of people sitting at a desk who are giving different opinions on it, say? And the importance of really paying attention to that, especially if there's any political connection to those topics at all. It's getting more difficult to find reliable sources of news unless you know what the difference is between news and commentary.
Yeah, my standby is still throughout my whole career and still now at postscript, or if I depends on how you look at it since I'm freelance now, but it's like it was always until the Associated Press reports it, it didn't happen. And I still really hold on to that because the Associated Press, I'm not saying they're perfect. They make mistakes as well, but they work very hard at making sure that it's vetted and it's trustworthy and it's accurate. And then when it's not, they make an effort to come back and correct it. Again, they don't get it right every time, but the effort is there, and it is a strong effort too. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so that
Yeah, I
that's
still read the
that's my
AP a
go-to.
lot and
Yep.
Reuters, and I try to have multiple sources of news
Hmm.
and try to have both broadcast and print sources still.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I mostly go with print, mainly because I don't get to watch TV that much anymore. So anything I can get in printed, but gosh, you got to be just as discerning there as well. But yeah, you're right. But I think we're running low on time now. So before we wrap up, I do have to ask, do you have any other just exciting tales from your past that you'd like to share? It's going to be tough to beat the first story you told me.
Yeah, the elephants in Barlow story. I would certainly refer for your viewers to that past episode. One does not get to cover stranded elephants from a circus train or circus truck every
Episode
day.
2, everybody, if anybody wants to go find it, it's still there.
So I don't know that I've got anything that great. Sometimes it's how you tell a story and not in exactly what happens. I got to do a story one time about a library book that was returned over 20 years late. And the book was How to Grow Houseplants. And the way I finished that story talked about, since that happened, the Challenger disaster had taken place, however many presidents we'd had at the time, and kind of listed three or four of these things. And my last line was, but people are still growing houseplants the same way.
There you go. I don't want to know what kind of fees they had racked up for that.
It was actually returned as part of a return a library book for free that was overdue time.
Good timing then.
Yes. But I did calculate at 25 cents a day how much the fees would have been had it
Oh
not
my
been.
gosh.
It was quite significant.
Oh yeah. So they picked the right day to come back. They're just waiting for that moment. Here it is. Now get it back there quick. Okay. Well, that's probably a good note to end on. A nice happy note of somebody being able to avoid library fees. So, hey, thanks again. Thanks for getting up early, so to speak, to chat with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I always enjoy this.
We'll have to do it again sometime. Thanks a lot.
Sounds good. Bye bye.
Hey, if you haven't already, be sure to visit the official Schorr Manor online t-shirt shop, the purveyors of all things spooky and all things Halloween, as long as it's in t-shirt form. You can find it at mattshore.net. Just click on shop at the top of the page. And while you're there, be sure to use the promo code journalist and get 10% off of everything in the store. Once again, that's mattshore.net and click on shop at the top of the page. Okay, thanks, Shelley. Thanks for that chat. Thanks for taking the time. We're all busy, and it's tough to find time to connect sometimes. So I appreciate it. Thanks so much. It was good to hear from you, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing well, that things are going good, that you are covering of all things the waterways. It's not something that when we first knew each other, I ever foresaw for you. But time leads us on unexpected and interesting paths. And all facets of journalism are extremely important and vital, even if they're not, sexy or exciting or whatever. They're still important. It's important to inform people about what's going on, and it's important to keep people informed about our waterways and the ships and boats that pass through them. Because if you don't know what's going on, you might run into somebody, or not happened too long ago, you might be driving an enormous boat and crash into a bridge and tear the whole thing down and become this big 2 year long legal drama. Um, there's too much to tell in that story. Some people may know what I'm talking about, others probably do not. But anyway, thank you again, Shelley. Thanks so much. All the best to you. And so, yeah, I guess moving on, I do have an announcement that I can make at this point, I think. In about a month, I am planning to return to Kickstarter. I didn't know how soon it would be till I'd get back. I figured I would, but I didn't really know. Anyway, now I know. Here we are. I'm going back to Kickstarter. This time it will not be for a comic book, however. It will be for a novel. I have a series of young readers' books, the Zombisaurus series, where I pit young people around the ages of 10 or 12 years old against otherworldly beasts from another universe. This is the fourth time I've written one of these books, so it's the fourth time these kids have had to save their town from these otherworldly creatures. So I'm giving these kids a really difficult childhood. Thank God they're fictitious, right? Anyway, it'll be called Flight of the Phantasmadactyls. It's a really fun story, and I hope that you will consider giving us a little bit of support on Kickstarter or just helping put the word out about the Kickstarter when it comes about. Either way, we would appreciate it. And I think that covers it. So thank you. So moving on, as we start to wind things down, we just say that this is a production of Schorr Manor Studio, and there are several great ways that you could follow Schorr Manor. First and foremost, if you're watching this, it's on YouTube. Go check out our YouTube channel. Just look up tinyurl.com/YouTube. That'll take you straight to us. Subscribe, and you can follow this podcast. You get full video as well as clips of this episode and previous ones, not to mention different ones in the future, and whole lot of video content. My wife is constantly creating shorts. funny and goofy ones that we're constantly putting out there on a daily basis. So please go check that out. You can also find some malevolent musings from the official Schorr Manor mascot, Benny the Skelly. So go check that out. You can also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Schorr Manor. We're also on TikTok, Wave of the Future. So just look up at Schorr Manor there. And we're also on Twitter, a little bit of the old school, at Schorr Manor. So and Instagram, before I forget, again at Schorr Manor. It's at Schorr Manor everywhere. So just look us up there wherever you do your social media browsing. As for me, you can also connect with me. My website, as I mentioned, is www.mattshorr.net. You can also follow me on social media on Twitter at the Matt Schorr, on Instagram at the Schorr, and finally, I have my own TikTok channel at the one Matt Schorr. That's the numeral one Matt Schorr. So go follow me there and check out all the things that I've got going on if you would like. You can also sign up for our newsletter. Just go to tinyurl.com/Schorr Manor newsletter. And believe that covers all of the social media things. If not, I'll think of it, right after we finish recording, which is, of course, how it goes. But thanks for sticking around this long. And as always, keep listening and keep reading. Thanks.